There's a fundamental misunderstanding most people have about communication. They think it begins when you open your mouth. It doesn't. Communication starts long before language enters the picture. It starts at the level of your nervous system, your emotional state, and the signals your body broadcasts without your awareness. And this is exactly where animals and babies live, completely tuned into that layer, completely dependent on it. When people ask why animals or infants stare at them, they're usually looking for something mystical. But the truth is more grounded and, in many ways, more powerful. What they're responding to is coherence. Your internal state, when it's aligned and calm, produces a kind of signal that doesn't need translation. There's no decoding required. It's immediate. It's instinctive. You have to understand animals don't have the luxury of misunderstanding energy. For them, misreading a signal can mean danger. So over time, their perception has evolved to become incredibly precise. They are constantly scanning for tension, inconsistency, threat. Babies, in a different way, operate under a similar system. They haven't yet learned to override their instincts with social conditioning. They don't second guess what they feel. If something feels safe, they lean in. If it doesn't, they withdraw. It's that simple. So when an empath walks into a room, something different happens. Not because of some abstract label, but because of what that person is actually doing internally. Empaths tend to process emotional information more deeply. They're often more aware of their own internal state, even if it feels overwhelming at times. And when that awareness turns into regulation, when they're not fighting their emotions, but understanding the mitt creates a kind of stillness. That stillness is what gets noticed. It's not about being nice or kind in the surface level sense. Animals don't care about your manners. Babies don't care about your social skills. They care about congruence. They care about whether what you feel matches what you show. And most people, if we're being honest, are out of sync. They smile when they're tense. They speak calmly when they're agitated. They say the right words, but their body tells a different story. That mismatch creates noise, and instinctively, animals and infants pick up on that noise as something uncertain. But when your internal state is clear, when you're not performing, not pretending, not masking, there's no noise. There's just signal. Clean, consistent, and easy to interpret. That's why you'll notice animals holding eye contact with certain people longer than usual. It's not curiosity in the way we think of it. It's assessment. And what they're finding is a lack of threat, a lack of contradiction. Babies do something similar, but with a different intention. When a baby stares, it's not analyzing, it's absorbing. They're taking in information about safety, about connection, about regulation. If your presence lowers their stress response, even slightly, they'll lock onto you. Because in their world, that matters more than anything else. This is where most people miss the deeper implication. It's not that empaths have some rare, unexplainable quality. It's that they're often closer to a state that humans were originally designed to operate from, a state where internal and external signals are aligned, where what you feel isn't hidden behind layers of strategy or defense. And that alignment changes how you're perceived, even if no one can articulate why. There's also something else happening here, something more subtle. When your nervous system is regulated, it doesn't just affect you. It influences the environment around you. This is well documented in psychology-co-regulation. One stable system can help stabilize another. That's why a calm person can de-escalate tension in a room without saying a word. Now imagine what that feels like to a being that relies entirely on that level of communication. To an animal, your presence either adds to their stress or reduces it. There's no middle ground. To a baby, your presence either feels safe or it doesn't. And when you consistently fall into that category of safety, when your energy isn't erratic, isn't unpredictable, you become something they're naturally drawn to. Not because you're trying to be, but because you're not trying at all. And that's the paradox. The more someone tries to appear safe, calm, or kind, the more likely they are to create subtle inconsistencies. Effort introduces friction. But genuine regulation, real internal clarity, doesn't require effort in the same way. It's stable, it's quiet, and it's unmistakable to anything that's paying attention at that level. So when you notice animals watching you or babies staring longer than expected, don't rush to label it as something extraordinary. See it for what it actually is: feedback. It's a reflection of your internal state, unfiltered and unbiased. And that's where the real value is. Because most of the world won't give you that kind of honest response. People are too conditioned, too distracted, too guarded, but animals and infants, they show you exactly what you're broadcasting, whether you realize it or not. If you understand that, you can start to shift your focus. Instead of trying to control how you're perceived, you begin to refine what you're actually projecting, not through performance, but through awareness, through regulation, through alignment. Because in the end, the most powerful form of communication isn't what you say. It's what others feel in your presence and whether or not their instincts trust it. If you take that idea a step further, that communication begins beneath words, then you start to see why authenticity isn't just a moral concept. It's a perceptual one. It determines how clearly others can read you. And this is where empaths tend to stand apart, not because they're trying to be transparent, but because they often don't have the same capacity to maintain emotional contradictions for long periods of time. Most people are trained, consciously or not, to present a version of themselves that fits the environment. That means adjusting tone, suppressing reactions, filtering thoughts, and sometimes completely masking what's actually happening internally. It's effective in a social sense, but it creates a split. There's an internal experience, and then there's the external display, and the two don't fully match. Now, other adults may not consciously notice that mismatch, but they feel it. It shows up as subtle distrust, hesitation, or a sense that something is off, even if they can't explain why. Animals and babies don't try to explain it at all. They just respond. An empath, by contrast, often operates with less separation between those two layers. It's not always comfortable. In fact, it can be overwhelming, but it does produce something rare. Emotional transparency. What you feel tends to move more directly into how you present. There's less delay, less distortion. And that matters more than most people realize. Because when a being that relies on instinct encounters you, it's not looking for perfection. It's looking for consistency. If your facial expression, body language, and internal state are aligned, the signal becomes easy to process. There's no ambiguity, no hidden variables, just clarity. Think about how unusual that is in everyday human interaction. People say one thing, feel another, and display something in between. Over time, we become skilled at navigating that complexity, but we also become desensitized to it. We accept a certain level of incongruence as normal. But instinct-driven perception doesn't adapt in that way. It doesn't lower its standards to match social behavior. It continues to look for alignment, because alignment equals predictability, and predictability equals safety. So when you show up without that internal conflict, when what you feel and what you express are in sync, it stands out immediately. Not in a dramatic way, but in a way that's unmistakable to anything paying attention at that level. This is why babies will sometimes lock their gaze onto a specific person in a room full of adults. It's not random. They're drawn to the clearest signal, the one that doesn't require effort to interpret, the one that feels stable. Animals respond in a similar way, but often with more caution. They observe first. They watch for changes, for inconsistencies, for any indication that what they're sensing might shift. And when it doesn't, when your presence remains steady, they relax into that space. Not because you've done anything to earn it in the traditional sense, but because you haven't given them a reason to question it. There's also a deeper philosophical layer to this. Emotional transparency isn't just about how others perceive you, it's about your relationship with yourself. When there's alignment between your internal and external states, it usually means you're not actively resisting what you feel. You're not trying to override it, suppress it, or reshape it to meet an expectation. That kind of internal honesty creates a form of psychological stability. Not because everything is calm all the time, but because whatever is there is acknowledged and integrated. There's no fragmentation. And fragmentation is what creates confusion in perception. When different parts of you are sending different signals, it forces others, whether human or animal, to work harder to interpret you. It introduces uncertainty. But when there's coherence, interpretation becomes effortless. This is why attempts to act authentic almost always fail. Authenticity isn't a behavior you can perform. It's the absence of performance. The moment you try to manufacture it, you reintroduce the very split that disrupts the signal. Empaths, whether they realize it or not, often move closer to that absence. Not because they've mastered it, but because they feel the cost of disconnection more intensely. Holding a false front isn't just tiring for them, it's disorienting. So over time, many of them default to a more direct expression of their internal state. And again, that's what gets noticed. not by everyone. In fact, in highly conditioned social environments, it might even go unrecognized or misunderstood. But by beings that rely on raw perception animals, infants, it becomes immediately apparent. So when you see that prolonged eye contact, that quiet attention, that sense of being observed without judgment, understand what's actually happening. You're not being evaluated based on your words, your status, or your behavior in the social sense. You're being read at a level that bypasses all of that. And what's being detected is alignment. The question then becomes, is that alignment something you're consciously cultivating, or is it something that happens by accident? Because once you understand this dynamic, it stops being a passive trait and starts becoming a deliberate practice. Not in the sense of trying to appear a certain way, but in the sense of reducing internal contradiction. Paying attention to where you're out of sync, where you're saying one thing and feeling another, where you're presenting something that doesn't match your actual state. That awareness alone begins to close the gap. And as that gap closes, your presence changes. Not in a way that's loud or attention-seeking, but in a way that's grounded and unmistakable. You become easier to read, easier to trust, not because you're trying to be trusted, but because there's nothing in you that needs to be hidden. And that's what instinct responds to every single time. So the next time you notice that kind of attention from an animal or a child, don't dismiss it or overinterpret it. Recognize it for what it is, a direct response to clarity, a moment where your internal and external worlds are aligned enough to be seen without distortion. And if you can learn to live from that place more consistently, not perform it, but actually embody it too, won't just change how others perceive you, you'll change how you experience yourself. Because the real power of authenticity isn't that it makes you more noticeable. It's that it makes you impossible to misread. Once you understand that your internal state is constantly communicating and that alignment makes you easier to read, the next layer becomes even more interesting because it moves from perception into influence. Not influence in the manipulative sense, but in the physiological sense, the effect your presence has on another living system. Every human being is carrying a nervous system that is either moving toward stress or away from it. There's no neutral position for very long. You're either activating tension through uncertainty, inconsistency, or pressure, or you're reducing it through stability and predictability. And most people underestimate how much of that process happens without a single word being spoken. Empaths, particularly those who have developed some level of self-awareness, often have a unique relationship with this dynamic. They're used to feeling what's happening around them. They pick up on shifts in tone, posture, energy. And while that can be overwhelming, it also creates the potential for something else: regulation. Because when you're aware of emotional input, you eventually face a choice. Either you become reactive to it, or you learn to process it without being destabilized by it. And when you reach that second state where you can feel without being thrown off balance, you become a stabilizing force. That's what animals and babies are responding to in this context. A regulated nervous system sends out very specific signals. Breathing patterns slow down, muscle tension decreases, movements become more deliberate and less erratic. Even eye contact changes, it becomes softer, less sharp, less interrogative. None of this is something you consciously perform. It's the byproduct of internal stability. And to an organism that relies on instinct, those signals are incredibly important. Think about a baby in distress. It doesn't have the cognitive ability to reason its way back to calm. It relies entirely on external regulation. The tone of voice, the rhythm of movement, the emotional state of the person holding it, these become inputs that either escalate or reduce its stress response. If you've ever seen a baby calm down almost instantly when handed to a specific person, you've witnessed this in real time. It's not random. It's not preference in the way adults think of preference. It's regulation. The same principle applies to animals, though often in a more cautious way. An animal will approach, observe, and test the consistency of your presence. If your behavior is unpredictable, whether your movements are abrupt, your attention scattered, it will remain guarded. But if your presence is steady, if your responses are measured, it begins to lower its defenses. Again, not because it trusts you in a conceptual sense, but because your signals don't trigger its survival mechanisms. This is where the idea of a calming presence often gets misunderstood. People assume it's about being passive, quiet, or overly gentle. But that's not necessarily true. You can be physically still and internally chaotic, and that chaos will still be detected. On the other hand, you can be active, engaged, even expressive, but if your internal state is stable, that stability carries through. So the real variable isn't behavior, it's regulation. And regulation isn't something you fake, it's something you build. It comes from understanding your own emotional patterns, recognizing when you're being pulled into reactivity, and developing the ability to return to a baseline without external validation. Empaths, because of their sensitivity, are often forced into this process earlier than others. They feel the cost of dysregulation more intensely. Environments that others might tolerate become overwhelming. Interactions that seem neutral to others feel charged. And over time, if they don't learn to regulate, they burn out. But if they do learn, if they develop that internal control, they end up with something that's hard to replicate. A nervous system that can remain stable in the presence of instability. And that's what creates the effect we're talking about. When you walk into a space with that kind of regulation, you're not just managing yourself, you're influencing the baseline of the environment. People may not consciously recognize it, but they feel it. Conversations slow down. Tension decreases. There's less urgency, less friction. For animals and babies, that effect is even more immediate because they're not filtering it through social interpretation. They respond directly to the shift. This also explains why the opposite can happen just as quickly. A highly anxious or tense individual can elevate stress in a room without saying anything. The body picks up on it. The signals are clear, even if they're not verbalized. So when you see an animal become unusually calm around someone, or a baby settle in their presence, you're looking at a form of feedback that's incredibly honest. It's showing you the impact of regulation in its purest form. And this is where it becomes practical, not just theoretical. Because if your presence can either increase or decrease stress in others, then it's worth asking a simple question. What are you contributing, moment to moment? Not in terms of what you intend, but in terms of what you actually project. Most people focus on controlling outcomes, what they say, how they're perceived, how they're interpreted, but very few focus on controlling their internal state at the level required to influence those outcomes naturally. And that's the shift. Instead of trying to manage the external, you start managing the internal. You pay attention to your breathing, your tension, your reactions. You notice when you're being pulled into stress and you develop the ability to step out of it, even briefly. Because every time you do that, you're not just changing your own experience. You're changing the signal you send to everything around you. And over time, that signal becomes consistent. That consistency is what creates trust. Not the kind of trust that's negotiated or explained, but the kind that's felt instantly. The kind that makes a baby relax in your arms or an animal sit quietly at your feet without needing to be trained to do so. It's not about control, it's about stability. So when you think about your presence, don't reduce it to personality or behavior. Look at it as a system, a living, responsive system that's constantly interacting with other systems. And the more stable yours becomes, the more it influences everything it comes into contact with. Because in the end, people may listen to your words, but every living being responds to your state. And the question is, when they do, does your presence create tension or does it quietly remove it? There's a point in understanding human behavior where you stop looking at people as purely rational actors and start seeing them as biological systems running older software systems that are still deeply connected to instincts we don't consciously access anymore. And when you look through that lens, the way animals and babies respond to certain people starts to make a lot more sense. Because they're not reacting to your identity. They're not reacting to your story, your achievements, your social role. They're reacting to something far more fundamental, what you represent at an instinctive level. And in many cases, what draws their attention is not dominance, not status, not even friendliness in the conventional sense. It's familiarity at a deeper layer of perception, something that feels uncorrupted, unmasked, and intact. You have to understand, animals and infants are operating from a perceptual framework that predates language. They don't interpret you through narrative. They interpret you through patterns, movement, tension, rhythm, stillness, consistency. And because of that, they can detect qualities in a person that most adults have learned to overlook or normalize. One of those qualities is emotional honesty. Not honesty as a moral choice, but honesty as a lack of internal division. When someone has spent enough time suppressing their instincts, they are able to make decisions based on logic and reason rather than their instincts. Ignoring their emotional signals or performing a version of themselves for others, something subtle happens internally. There's a fragmentation. The external self starts to operate independently from the internal experience, and over time that becomes the default. But there are individuals, often those labeled as empaths, who don't separate those layers as cleanly. Not because they're spiritually elevated or inherently different, but because their sensitivity makes sustained disconnection difficult. They feel the internal contradiction more acutely. They notice when something is off in their own system, and that awareness creates a different kind of presence. It's not that they are perfect or always balanced. That's not the point. The point is that they are often more available to their own internal signals. They haven't fully numbed the feedback loop between what they feel and what they express. And that partial preservation of internal access changes how they are perceived by beings that rely on instinct. Animals in particular are extremely sensitive to what I would call emotional integrity, not in the moral sense, but in the structural sense. Does the system hold together, or is it fragmented? Does the signal remain consistent over time, or does it fluctuate unpredictably? When they encounter someone whose internal state hasn't been fully separated from their external behavior, there's a kind of recognition. Not recognition of identity, but recognition of pattern. Something in that person's presence resembles a state that predates social conditioning, a state where signals were simpler, clearer, and more direct. That's why you sometimes see animals behaving differently around certain people without any prior exposure or training. They're not evaluating personality traits. They're evaluating the stability of the signal. And when that signal feels coherent, they respond with curiosity instead of avoidance. Babies operate in a similar way, but with even less filtering. They are essentially living feedback systems. Their attention is drawn to what is most legible to their nervous system. They don't yet have the cognitive interference that tells them to ignore what they feel in favor of what they should feel. So when a baby stares at someone for an extended period, what's happening is not social evaluation, it's neurological processing. They are trying to map a presence that feels structurally different from the noise they're surrounded by. And here's where the philosophical layer becomes important. In modern environments, most adults are constantly managing multiple layers of self-presentation. There's the internal emotional state, the socially acceptable version of that state, and the behavioral output designed to fit the context. Over time, this creates a kind of internal layering that distances a person from their own immediate experience. Children and animals don't operate that way. They respond to what is immediately present, not what is constructed. So when they encounter someone whose internal state is less obscured by layers of adaptation, it creates contrast. And contrast draws attention. That attention is often mistaken for something mystical or exceptional, but it's actually a form of clarity detection. They are identifying a signal that is easier to read than the surrounding environment. And there's something else that happens here that people often miss. When a being encounters clarity in another system, it can temporarily stabilize its own system. This is why certain people naturally calm animals or settle children without trying. It's not technique. It's not learned behavior. It's resonance. A stable system tends to stabilize other systems around it. But what makes this interesting from a psychological perspective is that it also reveals something about what we've lost in modern social conditioning. We've become so adapted to complexity, contradiction, and performance that simplicity itself can feel unusual, even suspicious at times. So when an empath or anyone with a more intact feedback loop between feeling and expression walks into a space, they can